the degree of entanglement we're seeing today is growing dramatically. And there are, conventional weapons programs by the US, but also by Russia and China as well, that is increasing the extent to which the nuclear and non-nuclear domains are interacting.
That's the voice of Dr. James Acton, co-director of the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now, here are your co-hosts, Michelle Dover and Tom Kalina.
Welcome back to Press the Button for what we really should be calling our special edition, All Things Nuclear Weapons All the Time episode. What do you think, Tom?
Well, Michelle, it's been a newsworthy week when the Air Force announces a sole source contract for the most controversial part of the nuclear modernization program. And it almost gets drowned out by President Trump's claim that the United States has a weapon system that no one's ever had in this country before.
That's right. It's been a wild week, and we'll be talking about both those points and more. Tom, who do you have lined up for early warning?
I had a great time talking with Bill Hartung from the Center for International Policy, who puts himself in the shoes of Northrop Grumman and explains in 5 easy steps how to sell a $100 billion nuclear missile that no one needs. It's a virtuoso performance that you won't want to miss.
After that, I sat down with Dr. James Acton from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He gave us his take on just what secret nuclear weapons program President Trump was talking about before warning us about the coming age of nuclear entanglement and the dangers it carries for crisis escalation.
And finally, Michelle answers a question sent to us by John from Hawaii about nuclear weapons assembly in today's Q&A segment. And remember, if you want your question answered on the air, tweet or DM us at PressButtonPod or send us an email at pressthebutton@plowshares.org. We can't wait to hear from you.
And as always, please click that subscribe button and give us a rating. Your feedback is what makes the show better. With that said, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thank you, Del, very much. This is Early Warning. Thank you all for being here. We have a very special guest today. Bill Hartung is Director of the Arms and Security Program at the Center for International Policy. Bill, thank you so much for being here.
Yes, thanks for having me.
We're here to discuss the news that was released last week that the Air Force awarded a sole source contract to Northrop Grumman for the new ICBM, Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. This new program is called the Ground-Based Strategic Deterrent, and just to add more acronyms to your day. And the Air Force awarded a $13 billion contract, which is but a small down payment on something that could be north of $100 billion when all is said and done. Bill, you and I essentially agree, I think, that the United States does not need a new nuclear ICBM for a number of reasons. One, it's not needed for deterrence. We have submarines that can do that. It increases the risk of war in response to a false alarm, nuclear war, that is, and that there's no rush for this system. And there's certainly no need for a sole source contract. And in a pinch, we could always extend the life of the Minuteman III, the existing ICBM. Would you agree with all that?
Yes, I stipulate that those are all viable, legitimate arguments that I agree with.
Excellent. So then what I'd like to move into is a conversation of, if you're Northrop Grumman, and you need to sell a $100 billion nuclear missile that no one needs, how do you do it? So that's our conversation. We're going to try to do this in 5 steps and in 7 minutes. And here we go. Step one, Bill. I think if you have a $100 billion missile that no one needs, you need to create a need. So how did Northrop Grumman do that in this case?
Well, you have to scare the hell out of people. And so the way to do that is say, Russia's getting ahead, China's getting ahead, we're vulnerable to a nuclear attack. When, of course, we have more than enough to deter either of those countries from attacking us, virtually regardless of what they do. And we're in the midst of a $2 trillion buildup of our own, of which the ICBM is an important component. But yeah, I mean, you have to scare people because otherwise they're not going to fork over that kind of money.
Great. And then two, you've got to get the military behind you, right? Obviously, the contractors can't sell these systems unless they have military support. How did Northrop get the military support they needed in this case?
Well, the Air Force has long depended on the ICBM to prop up large parts of its bureaucracy. Deploying and maintaining them is a good source of money for them. So basically, you're saying to the Air Force, you want to keep this gravy train running, right? I mean, you don't want to lose these things, and newer is always better, and which reinforces the need and so forth. And this goes way back to the beginning of the ICBM, where the Navy and the Air Force basically were duking out over who would have the nuclear mission, and the triad came out of that. Air Force said, no, you need ICBMs. Navy said, no, you need SLBMs. And they came up with doctrines to justify each of them. And so a lot of this really came about money and inter-service rivalry, even in the origins, and it's continued to this day.
Now, of course, Congress holds the purse strings, so you've got to convince Congress too. How did Northrop Grumman get congressional support for this?
Well, they're talking about 10,000 jobs just in the development phase, and maybe 10 times that if they go into production. So you spread that around the country, of course. But then also you've got the places where the ICBM bases are. In Wyoming, North Dakota, Montana, Utah, they do a lot of the work. Those senators form an ICBM coalition, which has blocked virtually every attempt to change ICBM policy, whether it's, eliminate silos we don't need anymore, whether it's study alternatives, whether it's Ro Khanna's attempt to cut $1 billion this year from the ICBM budget. All those things, they've got those senators on their side and blocking them, as well as places where they're dangling jobs as if the program goes forward.
Fourth on our list here, you need presidential support. How did that come about?
Well, the president, any president, and of course this president in particular, wants to posture as being tough, protecting us from our enemies, Russia and China. And so ICBMs are kind of a symbol of that. And that's been true in Reagan. It's been true in Democratic administrations. And so, no president under the kind of ideology of toughness wants to say, oh, I'm going to take a nuclear weapon off the table, even though, as you pointed out, we'd be safer to do so in the case of ICBMs.
And then lastly, you want to make your program so large, so robust, that even if the rationale changes or the winds shift, it's too big to fail. Now, it's not clear that they've actually done that yet, but how might they try to do that in this case?
Well, they're certainly trying to do it. And that's one of the reasons they gave out this contract before the election. They don't want to risk the idea that a new president's going to say, hey, wait a minute. We've got coronavirus. We've got an unprecedented recession. We've got all kinds of other national needs. Maybe we don't need a new ICBM. So they're hoping that if they can get the money flowing, get the development going, it'll be harder to turn back. But in fact, even if they had to pay a little money for a contract cancellation, compared to spending $100 billion on a weapon we don't need, that would be well worth it. But they're going to argue otherwise. They're going to say, well, the program's going full speed ahead. Can't pull the plug now. And in fact, there's this old saying, there's only two stages in a weapon system: too early to cancel and too big to fail. And so there's sort of never a good time from the Pentagon's point of view to get rid of a weapon system.
So there you have it. There's how you sell a $100 billion nuclear missile that no one needs in 5 steps and less than 7 minutes. Some of these factors can be changed going forward. Of course, we have a presidential election coming up. That may change the White House factor in all this. And then also, let's hope, as we were discussing, that it isn't yet too big to fail. I think part of our job is to stop it before it gets too big to fail. But in any case, Bill, that was a fabulous exploration of how this all happens. There is the siren. Our time is up. But Bill, I want to thank you so much, and thanks our listeners. And we hope to see you on the show again soon.
Yes, thanks so much for having me. It's always good to be on.
Dr. James Acton holds the Jessica T. Matthews Chair and is co-director of the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. A physicist by training, James' current research focuses on the escalation risks of advanced conventional weapons and the future of arms control. You may have seen his work in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, many other outlets, and he has also appeared on CNN's State of the Union, NBC Nightly News, CBS Evening News, and PBS NewsHour. James, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Michelle.
Okay, so let's get straight to some recent news. Nuclear Twitter has been debating what nuclear weapons system President Trump told Bob Woodward about in one of his recorded interviews, where he said, "I have built a nuclear weapons system that nobody's ever had in this country before." Woodward said other sources confirmed the information without adding details, but they were surprised that Trump disclosed it. What does this refer to? And more broadly, what types of new systems is the U.S. investing in?
Sure. So we've had a fun 48 hours on nuclear Twitter debating this. My personal theory is that the president was referring to something called the W76-2 warhead, which in English is a low-yield warhead. So it has less explosive power that the United States has developed for the ballistic missiles carried by Ohio-class submarines. And low yield here means something like 7,000 or 9,000 tons of TNT equivalent. So this is still a very, very big boom, but it's kind of 20, 30 times whatever smaller than the warheads which these are traditionally are. Now, this program, this so-called low-yield D5 program, is not a secret. It was publicly announced by the administration, but the timing of the first deployment was secret. That is to say, the Pentagon kept it a secret when they were putting the first one of these warheads onto the missiles until after the event. And so my theory is that, and the timing lines up for this, as in fact your immediate previous president pointed out on Twitter as well. He's also an advocate of this theory, Joe Cirincione, that the president was referring to this low-yield D5 warhead and was revealing that the first one had been or was about to be put at sea. There's other theories too. Jeffrey Lewis, my friend, has been arguing that it's some kind of hypersonic missile, probably non-nuclear. There's another theory that there is a really genuinely new capability that the president was referring to. I think that's possible. I don't think it's a nuclear capability. I just don't think that the United States has the capability. I just don't think we could build a new nuclear warhead in secret. Or it could be bluster, just referring to nothing at all. That's what I put out a kind of Twitter poll for fun. That's what about 50% of people on Twitter seem to think. So, as I say, I think it's the low-yield D5 warhead, but if I were an intelligence analyst, I would make that assessment with low confidence.
It's just an interesting thing to come up, in this environment when we talk about, what systems are the U.S. investing in? How does this track with what you're seeing more broadly?
When we're thinking about U.S. investments, U.S. spending on nukes, a good place to start is kind of the additions that the Trump administration made on top of what the Obama administration did. The Obama administration basically announced a like-for-like replacement kind of all of the existing systems that the US has. So plans for a new ICBM, plans for new submarines, plans for a new cruise missile. All of these were developing new versions of existing systems. The Trump administration has made kind of a number of additions to this plan. The first one, which has already happened and gone to sea, was the low-yield D5 warhead, the one we've already been discussing. So in addition to the low-yield D5 warhead, the Trump administration has announced a plan to develop a new sea-launched cruise missile. So this would be carried by attack submarines, maybe by surface ships. This would be a nuclear-armed sea-launched cruise missile. It's a kind of capability that the Obama administration retired. And then in addition to that, and more recently, we've heard a plan to develop a new warhead for ICBMs, the so-called W-93. So these are all new things that the Trump administration has done on top of the Obama administration. And I think, for me, the really interesting question here is what are the escalation risks of all of these different systems? And this actually, I think, brings us back to the most interesting of the Woodward revelations yesterday, at least so far as they pertain to nukes. I mean, what capability Trump was referring to is an interesting question. I think his revelation that Mattis was deeply, deeply concerned that we were going to get into a real fighting match with North Korea back in 2017 and that fighting match could turn nuclear, to the extent that he was sleeping in his clothes, so he was ready to come to the Pentagon quickly, that he was praying regularly. That kind of indicated to me the severity of the crisis in North Korea, and that should make us think about escalation risks today.
And you're just focusing on the nuclear investments. A lot of your work has also been on hypersonic glide vehicles. And so I'm curious to know a little bit more. When we talk about nuclear risk, are we only talking about what comes from the nuclear systems themselves? Or how does this, when you enter this complex field that also involves conventional threats, what does it mean for escalation?
So this is a question that's kind of very near and dear to my heart. There is something that I call the growing entanglement between nuclear and non-nuclear weapons. Now, during the Cold War, the nuclear and non-nuclear domains were largely distinct. The primary threats to nuclear weapons came from other nuclear weapons. Most delivery systems were nuclear or they were conventional, but they couldn't accommodate both types of warheads. Now, that's somewhat of an oversimplification of the Cold Wars, right? There were some so-called dual-use warheads, dual-use delivery systems that could accommodate nuclear or non-nuclear warhead. There were certainly some conventional submarines pose conventional threats to nuclear submarines that carry ballistic missiles. So, that's a slight oversimplification of the Cold War. But the degree of entanglement we're seeing today is growing dramatically. And there are, conventional weapons programs by the US, but also by Russia and China as well, that is increasing the extent to which the nuclear and non-nuclear domains are interacting. So, just to give you one example, and, I do want to talk about the Russian and Chinese programs as well, but since you mentioned hypersonic glide vehicles, let's start with the United States. So, ballistic missiles are launched by large rockets, and they go very high above the atmosphere and then arc downwards again. Gliders are launched by very similar kinds of rockets, but rather than going high above the Earth's atmosphere, they re-enter very quickly and then they glide at exceptionally fast speeds. It's a bit like a hang glider, if you like, but in the sense it's unpowered and it's lifted up by aerodynamic lift, but going much, much faster than a hang glider. The US is exclusively interested to date in conventional gliders. That could change. We've thought about nuclear gliders in the past, but today all the interest is in conventional gliders. And indeed, not even in intercontinental range systems, in shorter range systems. But nonetheless, these are the kinds of weapons that Russia and China worry that we're developing to hold their nuclear forces at risk, to be able to attack their nuclear forces. Now, I don't think that's why the US is developing conventional gliders. And they're not even very long-range systems at the moment that the US is focused on. But I think those Russian and Chinese concerns are real, that the US will ultimately develop these very long-range, very fast conventional weapons that could hold their nuclear forces at risk. And that could create these so-called use them or lose them dynamics. Like you're in a deep war, serious crisis, the Russians or Chinese believe that the US is planning to attack their nuclear weapons preemptively. Even if that concern is wrong, that could give Russia or China an incentive to use nuclear weapons first.
And I actually want to draw out, going back to the Russian and Chinese programs, I feel like in recent months, just as tensions have risen, especially with China. Questions about what their posture and investments mean for global risk. I mean, modernization is not something that's limited to the U.S.
No, that's right. And, I think one of the most interesting developments going on in Russia and China at the moment, but even more so Russia than China, but in both countries, is developing dual-use missiles of ever longer ranges. So these are missiles that can accommodate nuclear or non-nuclear warheads. We're seeing this in China with its own missile program. So, for example, China has recently started to deploy a missile called the DF-26. This is a missile with a range of, I think, the estimates are like 3,000, 3,500 kilometers, something like that. And this is a missile that could have a nuclear or a non-nuclear warhead. And this creates, I think, various risks of so-called warhead ambiguity. So, for example, just to give you one example, imagine, again, none of this is a particular problem in peacetime. All of this becomes a problem in a deep crisis or a war. But imagine that the US and China are in a shooting match, and China deploys conventional DF-26s, so missiles with non-nuclear warheads. But imagine that the US gets that wrong, right? Imagine the US intelligence gets it wrong and thinks they're nuclear-armed DF-26s, right? From a US perspective, that represents a big escalation of the crisis. China has just deployed nuclear warheads, but this, and that could ultimately prove quite escalatory. But that kind of escalation is inadvertent because China hasn't, in fact, deployed nuclear warheads. We've just misidentified it. The other way around is a problem too, right? Imagine that China deploys nuclear-armed DF-26s, and we think they're conventional DF-26s. And then we go and we try to hunt down and attack these missiles. If we're successful, we've inadvertently destroyed nuclear weapons, which from a Chinese perspective is extremely escalatory. Now, the US has some dual-use capabilities, really just aircraft. But China, and particularly Russia, is really investing very, very heavily in these dual-use capabilities, missiles in particular.
None of these actions, none of these, systems were laid out in the laws of nature. What steps could countries be taking, especially in the U.S., to move towards a place that would provide greater stability, greater clarity in the escalatory ladder? This, to me, just like listening it feels like very much we're headed for this crisis that, we could have been able to avoid had we taken steps earlier.
Right. I think that's right. And, I could happily spend hours discussing different escalation pathways. But I think you're right to kind of focus here on the question of risk reduction. I think it's helpful, firstly, to distinguish between unilateral risk reduction and cooperative risk reduction, right? So unilateral risk reduction is that steps that we, the United States, would take ourselves, and the Chinese would take by themselves, and the Russians would take by themselves. And then you have cooperative measures. Now, I think the cooperative measures are ultimately more effective, but they're also harder to orchestrate right now. So let's start by thinking about unilateral measures. And then, we can discuss the kinds of things that states should do cooperatively, even if they're kind of unlikely to do so at the moment. The most fundamental thing that I think we need to do is factor escalation risks into our acquisition, war planning, crisis management. I don't have clearances. I don't have access to classified information. I can't prove that we don't do that at the moment, but I have a pretty strong hunch that we don't do that in a serious and systematic way at the moment. When we're thinking about acquisitions policy, I think it's really important to have somebody going, look, there are really big risks associated with these systems. Let's weigh those up against the military benefits. Or, if we're considering striking, if we're developing war plans that involve striking Russian or Chinese dual-use command and control assets, those that have both nuclear and non-nuclear functions, right? Somebody needs to go, there are military advantages to doing this. There's also big risks. So that the key decision makers in these processes can be informed of these benefits and risks. Now, a lot of that is kind of mundane, behind the scenes, not public work. It's the kind of stuff that necessarily doesn't attract outside attention, but it's the kind of internal thinking and work that I think needs to be done. To give you another example, one of the things that I worry about a lot is the vulnerability of the US nuclear command and control system. Now, in fact, we don't actually have a nuclear command and control system. We have a command and control system that does nuclear stuff and conventional stuff. All of the big pieces of hardware that are almost all of the big pieces of hardware that are publicly known about are nuclear or conventional. Are dual use. They have both nuclear and conventional functions. And this, I think, can create real danger. So, just to give you one example, our early warning satellites are used and have long been used to detect an incoming nuclear attack against the United States. But they're also used to detect non-nuclear ballistic missiles and hence cue regional ballistic missile defenses. So in a conflict, Russia might start attacking these early warning satellites so that its non-nuclear missiles can penetrate missile defenses in Europe. But from our perspective, it looks like Russia's preparing for nuclear war because it's just taken our early warning satellite. Now, one of the things that worries me is, to the extent they're known, and they're pretty murky at the moment, our plans for replacing our early warning satellites appear to be to build exactly what we have at the moment, but one fewer satellite, to build a less redundant system of the existing early warning satellite system, right? I think that's a big mistake. Now, there's lots of different ways we can go, and I don't want to make people's eyes glaze over with technical details, but suffice to say that you do something like build a less redundant command and control system, a command and control system that would be more vulnerable in the conventional phase of a war before anything nuclear happens, if you're not thinking about these escalation risks. So, that's the kind of thing that I think we really ought to be factoring into planning.
Before we get to the cooperative measures, I am always fascinated by bureaucratic politics, by institutional prerogatives. How much do you think that these decisions in where we are placing our bets are related to, the Department of Defense and other broader institutions that are interested in this versus a president? Is this a trajectory that the U.S. has been on for a while, or do you see the opportunity for changes?
Yeah, so, there's this great question. There's a lot to unpack there. I think that most of the decisions we're thinking about, especially when we're thinking about new command and control satellites, these are not being taken at the level of a president. They're enormously expensive programs that are, decisions are being made at a kind of, probably deputy secretary level. I'm sure the Secretary of Defense is informed about these, but I imagine it's more the deputy secretary that digs down into the details of this stuff. I'm not 100% certain, but this stuff is below presidential level. I think a lot of what goes on in terms of decisions just to recreate an existing command and control architecture that we know is flawed comes from the fact that it's relatively straightforward just to do the same thing again, and change is difficult. The US is used to operating with a relatively small number of incredibly sophisticated early warning satellites. Radically changing that architecture is not just expensive, it's also that it requires organizational change to get used to and implement a new architecture. And so it's very easy just for institutions, unless they're really pushed for change, to try to essentially do like-for-like replacements, just to kind of keep on doing what they're doing, just with better technology. And that, I think, is a mistake in a lot of the nuclear space, particularly in the command and control space. If this is too low level for a president to be directly involved in, how do you get change? And I think the answer is you need somebody whose job it is to advocate for managing escalation risks. So, to give you one example, by law, the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy is responsible for reviewing war plans to make sure they're consistent with civilian guidance. Now, that's obviously not, he or she doesn't personally sit down and read the war plans. They delegate that responsibility. But, I think that's a good precedent here, right? I would want to see the Undersecretary of Defense Policy made legally responsible for assessing acquisitions, war plan, crisis management, whatever, to ensure that escalation risks are being considered, right? I think Congress should actually allocate that as an enumerated responsibility of the deputies, of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy.
And then you said the cooperative actions are harder, but what's the first step that the U.S. needs to start advocating for and you hope to see from the other nuclear-armed countries?
So the first thing to say is, like, I can give you lots of ideas, and I'm going to give you them. But I think the first thing you have to do is to get the countries talking about these risks. The US can't dictate how other countries perceive these risks. Russia and China are clearly very worried about the survivability of their nuclear forces. That's an issue that the US has to be willing to discuss with them. If the US is worried about Russian and Chinese ASAT capabilities and wants Russia and China to discuss those. ASAT being anti-satellite weapons. So, the first thing you have to do is create a forum by which, probably actually two separate bilateral forums. Like, I don't think trilateralism is the right way forward here. I think you want one US-China forum and one US-Russian forum. In which each side can discuss its concerns and they can kind of jointly discuss what the risks are. And then in terms of what concrete risk reduction would look like. To give you a couple of examples, right? One of the good things about the status quo is we have no intercontinental dual-use missiles. Right now, all of the dual-use missiles have ranges shorter than 5,500 kilometers, which is the boundary where intercontinental starts. We should look to preserve that situation. So I think a three-way moratorium on the development of dual-use intercontinental missile types would be a really good idea, right? Russia, the US, and China would agree that any type of intercontinental missile they develop, ballistic, cruise, or boost glide, would either be nuclear or it would be conventional, but it wouldn't be both. And this is any cooperative measures I give you are a lift, but what I like about that idea is it's not rolling back a capability that's already existing. It's preventing a new problem from arising, and that's an easier thing to do. Let me give you another example. The most important nuclear command and control assets are all in really high orbits, so-called geostationary orbit. They are thousands and thousands of kilometers above the surface of the Earth. We don't tend to think about space security for those assets very much. A lot of the space security community is focused on satellites that are much closer to the Earth, stuff that's in so-called low Earth orbit, because those are the satellites that are most at risk. But actually, from a nuclear command and control perspective, it's the stuff at very high orbits that's not the stuff that's most at risk at the moment. That's most important, but also that stuff is not the most at risk because that's the stuff that's hardest to attack. So you can think about measures to enhance the security of these command and control satellites in extremely high orbits. So, for example, maybe the US, Russia, and China could agree to a moratorium on testing ground-based anti-satellite weapons above a certain altitude, right? You're not allowed to test higher than, say, 10,000 kilometers or 15,000 kilometers. Now, there's risks associated with this idea, right? Maybe it normalizes testing satellites. It implies implicit permission to test at lower altitudes, which is, again, something we don't want to see. But that's a real risk. But to my mind, the benefit of preserving the security of these really high altitude satellites, preventing nuclear war, that's something it's worth doing even if there's detriments.
James, it's been such a pleasure to have you on. But before we go, how did you move from physics to nuclear policy, and why nuclear weapons?
I started my PhD in physics like an embarrassingly long time ago now, fully with the intention of becoming an academic physicist. And the thing about modern physics is either you have to work on really narrow problems or you have to be a complete physics genius, which I never was, who's capable of working on the really big, important problems. And about halfway through my PhD, it was pretty clear to me that I was never really going to enjoy spending a career focused on these really narrow problems. And I became kind of increasingly interested in foreign policy type issues. I often say that I preferred reading foreign affairs to physical review in the evening. And so, I decided that when I wanted to, that after I finished my PhD, I was going to look for a job in something public policy related. I was always interested in nuclear weapons, and if you're a physicist, then nukes are kind of a good space to get into. With a lot of luck, I kind of got a job doing initially at a very small British think tank that does great work, Vertic, focused on verification issues, and then expanded out from there, and the rest is history, really.
Well, I'm so glad you made the jump, and so glad to have you as a colleague. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much for having me, Michelle. It's always a great pleasure.
Letters, we get stacks and stacks of letters.
And now everyone's favorite nuclear Q&A segment. This week's question was sent to us by John from Hawaii. John asks, the Pantex plant in Amarillo, Texas, is the primary facility for final assembly, dismantlement, and maintenance of nuclear weapons in the United States, yet it's almost invisible and unknown to the public. For all who aren't familiar with America's only nuclear weapons assembly plant, what do you think is the most important thing to understand about this facility?
Thanks, John. It's a really good question. And you actually nailed it in how you framed it. Pantex was actually originally a conventional weapons site that was turned into a nuclear weapons production site after World War II as the U.S. scaled up its production. And today is a key part of what we call the weapons complex that maintains the arsenal. So, it can store, I believe, around up to 20,000 plutonium pits at any one time. One of the most interesting things, though, about Pantex is what you said, John, that it's fairly low profile in the American public. So when you think of production sites, you might immediately go towards Los Alamos, which absolutely, does plutonium pit production, or think of the other weapons labs, including Sandia or Livermore. But in reality, you have a complex web across the country. You have Y-12 in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. You have the Kansas City plant in Missouri. You used to have Rocky Flats in Colorado. And Livermore National Lab used to produce plutonium pits. And now the U.S. is actually considering adding Savannah River as a new pit production site. So what does it mean, though, when we think about Pantex or any other of these key industrial sites? You have a huge life support system for a nuclear weapons arsenal. As long as the U.S. is going to have nuclear weapons, it's committed to a safe, secure, and reliable arsenal that requires, a huge amount of money, of technology, of human capital in order to maintain it. Now, this also plays another, flip that coin. It means there's a huge amount of money that goes into it, and that is at stake, that's spread across the country. So, you have quite a few of representatives or senators who have invested interests in keeping these jobs and keeping these sites open. And then you have as well the environmental impact of each of these sites. For Pantex in 1994, it was listed as a Superfund site. I think in 2010, it was said, EPA said things are under control. But you look at the legacy of the Hanford site, another production site, of Y-12, of Los Alamos. I mean, these legacies will, I would expect, long outlast the weapons themselves, and are a major concern for local communities and should be for the U.S. as a whole. So what should you think? What should you know about Pantex? It is a key part in maintaining the arsenal, and also will be a huge part in dismantlement, and also is representative in some ways of the obstacles that will come
with rolling back the nuclear weapons complex.
Another week, another question. Thanks, Michelle. And thank you, John. Remember, if you would like to get your question answered on the air, tweet or DM us at PressButtonPod or send us an email at pressthebutton@plowshares.org.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil, Zach Brown, Derek Zender, and Will Lowry. Sound design by Derek Zender. Audio engineering by Derek Zender and Will Lowry. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.